We are talking today with Robert Scheer. Robert Scheer is editor-in-chief at truthdig.org and a contributing editor at The Nation. Between 1964 and 1969, he was Vietnam correspondent, managing editor, and editor-in-chief of Ramparts magazine. From 1976 to 1993, he served as a national correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, and in 1993, he launched a nationally syndicated column based at the Los Angeles Times, where he was named a contributing editor. He can be heard on the political radio program Left, Right, and Center on KCRW, the NPR affiliate in Santa Monica, California. And he is currently a clinical professor of communications at the University of Southern California Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. He has written 10 books, including America After Nixon, The Age of Multinationals, The Pornography of Power, How Defense Hawks Hijacked 9/11 and Weakened America, The Great American Stick-Up, How Reagan Republicans and Clinton Democrats enriched Wall Street while mugging Main Street. And he is here to talk about his latest book, They Know Everything About You, How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy. Robert, thank you very much for coming and spending time with us today. So start out, tell us, what was the motivation in writing your latest book, They Know Everything About You?
Well, back in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president, he teamed up with Republicans in the Congress to push through radical financial deregulation at the behest of the banking lobbies. It was the reversal of the prize piece of financial legislation that came out of the Great Depression, out of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Glass-Steagall Act, which restricted what different banks could do to protect consumers, to protect deposits, so you wouldn't have any too-big-to-fail banks. And another piece of legislation, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which took away any restrictions on all these collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps. So he ushered in really the terrible recession that happened under George W. Bush and continued up through Obama. Well, at that time, in addition to covering that, I noticed there was a big issue involved concerning your data, your privacy, because it was very clear that the lobbyists were for the merger of all these, insurance companies, banks, investment houses, and everything, because they were grabbing all this data. And this is when big data was born. And at that time, there were some people who said this is really very dangerous. One of them was a congressman from Massachusetts, Ed Markey, who's now, fortunately, the senator. He's the junior senator of Elizabeth Warren. So we have a state there. It's got two terrific senators. But also it included conservatives like William Safire, who had been Nixon's speechwriter and then become a columnist at the New York Times. But like many principal libertarians that we have now around Silicon Valley, we do have them. Electronic Frontier Foundation and other folks. I shouldn't characterize them. I'm sure they have a lot of different people in there, but I seem to meet libertarians when I go interview them. But back then in the 90s, they were the people pushing back, and they said, no, you shouldn't be allowed to merge all this data because people didn't give their insurance data with the idea that their mortgage broker would have it or that there's somebody trying to sell them a car or hustle something else. They should control that. And so, problem that exists obviously right to now, a company like Facebook, and you're going to get an app like WhatsApp, and you're going to have all this data, and you're going to pool it, and what are you going to use it? So the privacy advocates back then said, let's put in a protection of opt-in. The consumer who surrendered this data in the first place, say, to their life insurance company, doesn't want the bank to have their medical records or anything else. And so before you can pass it around, either to your affiliate that you've now merged or to a third-party company, you should have the explicit opt-in permission. And that remains the big battle today. Instead, the banking lobbyists said, no, we want opt-out, which is all this junk mail you get and says, hey, if you've discovered something you don't like, you can complain about it, lots of luck, and so forth. It's totally meaningless restraint. And the people like Markey and Safire and others urged President Clinton to veto the bill unless there was this protection. He betrayed that concern, and because the banking lobbyists said, no, we want to exploit this data. They didn't say exploit. We want to better, more effectively market to people. And that's why when you're on the internet and everything, all these ads pop up around where somebody has sold your data or mined your data. So that was my interest at the time. And then I was also interested, what is this internet doing to privacy? And I was editor of something called the Online Journalism Review at the University of Southern California. So I was interested in where's the internet going. And I'm not anti-internet. I'm a big celebrant of the internet. I love technology. I'm not a Luddite, I worked on my first big computer. It was an IBM machine, took up a whole warehouse, huge warehouse, and when I was in graduate school, and it had less power than a smartphone now. But I always was an early adapter. I liked the stuff. And I saw that the internet was a way of uniting people, educating people, and was a great thing. But I also saw the downside. So in 1999, I wrote an article for Yahoo Internet Life, which was the cover of a whole issue devoted to this question of where's the internet going as far as privacy. And at that time, I was concerned because the FBI and the CIA, they had these various programs, Carnivore and others, that were getting people's data. And this was before 9/11. And at that time, you still could get a good discussion going about the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and other protections of our individual sovereignty. And so I did this whole issue, and I warned that we were developing a technology that was a dictator's wet dream in the old days, a Stalin or a Hitler or somebody. You just had all this data, and, well, that was 99. And, now you see where the data is going. Well, the thing that changed, because we would have had a good discussion about it and maybe had reform, was 9/11. And the 9/11 World Trade Center and Pentagon attack became this great excuse for destroying the American Constitution. That's how I see it. Because the essential wisdom of the Constitution, the framers, the people who gave us the Constitution, we know they were flawed. We know they had their contradictions. We know their notion of democracy was basically limited to white males and of some, means. However, they had gotten hold of two really important ideas, and that informed our Constitution. One was, if you want to be a representative republic, you can't be an empire. And that's the lesson they drew from Europe. They drew it from, Spain, France, England, but they also drew it, obviously, from the Roman Republic. If you're going to conquer, you're going to be in foreign entanglements, you're going to be messing around the world. As people say in war, truth is the first casualty, and your citizens back in the home republic are going to lose control of the whole thing. They're going to be mired in secrecy and treachery and intrigue, and it's going to go. They understood that very clearly, what had gone wrong with Europe. And so that's why they were very much against the empire, big government. Unfortunately, they had a contradiction. They were building an empire within North America, but in the main, though, they understood the problem of foreign intrigue. But the really important idea that was connected with that was the idea of limited government. Be suspicious of government, rein in its power, have separation of powers, have checks and balances, go for a Bill of Rights. Why? Because they believe very deeply that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so the public, the individuals out there, should have guarantee of their sovereignty. They are ceding limited powers to the state and then to the national, even more limited to national government, and that they always have to be protected in their right to assemble, to redress grievances, and freedom to press and freedom to associate, and freedom in their own home, the Fourth Amendment and others, in terms of trial and due process and everything. Why? Because the public was going to be suspicious of government power. Okay. Well, what happened after 9/11? We flipped that whole concept, and we said, no, the public is now going to be treated with suspicion, and the government is going to be doing the checks and balances on the public. And that's where you got the idea of the haystack of information of everybody's personal data from the whole world, including the leader of Germany, Brazil, but the whole world. Why? To find the few suspicious needles. Okay, so the great mass of people are viewed with suspicion by a government that is free of being viewed this way, because everything is secret, tied up, and we don't know what they're doing. A story in today's papers we record, be old news by the time you broadcast this, but the fact is, they police departments routinely now intercept, mock a cell phone center and routinely intercept all this data on everybody. They claim they're only going after a few bad guys, but they have all this stuff, Stingray and these different programs. Well, but that's not new. This is what's been developing all over the place. And you have privately held for-profit companies like the one that was doing Stingray, but you also have Palantir and others mining data formed by the CIA originally, backed by the CIA. The CIA was their main client, the only client for the first 3 years, but now, they can do anything. They're go through the data of the L.A. Police Department, the New Orleans Police Department, as well as all of our intelligence agencies, CIA, NSA, and everything else. So we've created this monster in the wake of 9/11, a totally unregulated, uncontrolled, unknown to us. This story in New York Times, as we were recording this, in Santa Clara County in California, one supervisor objected to their program. He said, "What is Stingray? What are we doing here?" And he can't even ask that question. They have to all sign non-disclosure agreements. Anybody's going to work with it. So we've turned this whole idea of the public watching government around to the government watching the public in the name of making us safer. So that's a long-winded way of telling you how I got into this. But then in writing this book, because I wanted to pursue it in more detail, and the website that I edit, TruthDig, we won 5 Webbies for the best political blog 3 times, and 2 times I've lost track, but for the best political site. But we go back to these meetings. We're involved with a lot of people on the internet who like the internet, and so the problem was I kept asking people what's going on, and I found many people were concerned. The last Webby thing in New York, they celebrated Aaron Swartz and talked about the need to hold in check. And so there's a real sense that something is awry. What is the bright spot in all this is that with the Snowden leaks, and I think Edward Snowden's the greatest American citizen since Daniel Ellsberg. I think they're doing what the whole thing is based on, independent, honest people telling us the truth about what's going on when our government lies to us. They're heroes. And so with the Snowden leaks, we learned, we had suspicions, we knew bits of it, but he released so many documents, it's irrefutable, that in fact, we always knew the internet was originally a government creation. We knew DARPA had done it. It was all part of the Cold War. How do you have a robust system to withstand nuclear explosion and so forth? But what we didn't know was the detail of interconnection between Silicon Valley and the internet companies and the telecoms, AT&T and Verizon, and the defense establishment. And you now have, the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about. It's really the military intelligence complex. And it's horrible, because what you have is the very people who are assessing the danger have a stake in inflating the danger. That's what Eisenhower warned about. They control the information. Everything is classified. They tell you these are the bad guys. They're growing all the time. This is the way to fight them. And we have the tools, and we'll make the money from fighting them. And that's what's happened here with the whole data mining and everything else. But what Snowden did is he showed the contradiction in the system to the whole world. Because what he was able to show is that this private data, which we were giving up to private companies, was not private at all, that government had ready access to it. And not only our government, which some people delude themselves into thinking is always benign. That part, like my students and so forth, they say, well, why would the government be concerned? This is what Eric Schmidt, the head of Google, had said. This is what Zuckerberg had said. What do you have to hide? Don't do anything you have to hide. Well, the whole assumption of our society is not that we are the ones that should have this zone of protection because we have something to hide. It's because the government is going to make stuff up about us. The government is going to intimidate us. The government is going to force us into self-censorship. This is the 1984 Brave New World warning. And if we don't have the protection in the Fourth Amendment of our own space, we're not free to think, to explore, to challenge, to question, to push the envelope and do all these things. And this Fourth Amendment, I carry it around with me. I hope I have a copy of it with me. Do you happen to have a copy of the Fourth Amendment? Oh, I have it right here. Sorry. My memory is no longer as good as it used to be. And the language of the Fourth Amendment is so clear that I feel the need to read it to people. Now, mind you, where did this Fourth Amendment come from? It comes from the Magna Carta, really. It comes from English common law. It was an idea developed against the king and to restrain the king in England. And it was basically that even the King of England, with divine right to rule and everything else, could not go into the hut of the poorest peasant and rummage around and find incriminating material and then jail him, okay, seize their property. Not allowed to do that. Had to have a specific warrant, couldn't have a general warrant, had to have due process, had to, make a case and why they were there, okay, very specific. And so that language is in our Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Not a fishing expedition, not rummaging around, very specific that you've got some magistrate to sign off on. After 9/11, we turned that upside down. And the whole argument then became, oh, the cat's out of the bag, modern technology, the bad guys have access to all this stuff, we have to have the haystack, we have to run. And the main thing was, that constitutional protection, the Fourth Amendment, that doesn't work anymore because we have the internet, and we have computers, and we have smartphones. Fortunately, we've had a very clear ruling from the Roberts Supreme Court, a conservative court, last June of 2014 on the cell phone case and the police. And it set the law very clear. It said a couple of things. It said, one, the Fourth Amendment is very much alive. Roberts pointed out in his decision, the American Revolution started over the principle of the Fourth Amendment. This is what the Boston Tea Party about, the whole objection to the agents of the king coming into your business, your home, rummaging around until they found something incriminating, was what ticked off. He said it, Roberts, in his decision, unanimous decision, the liberals, conservatives all signed off on it. And he said, this is what sparked the American Revolution. And he had, can quote John Adams, who was there at the key trial, dealing with it and so forth. It's all in my book and everything. So that's number one. Secondly, he took on this argument that somehow technology trumps the wisdom of the Fourth Amendment. Internet and everybody's got smartphones. And he said, no, that's precisely the reason. He took the argument and turned it around again. He said, that's precisely the reason why the Fourth Amendment is more relevant than ever and has to be interpreted in a broader sense to accommodate modern technological situations. He said, this is Roberts. He said, there's more information on that cell phone than was ever in anybody's home. Okay, and that means that the police crack your code, your sign-on or whatever, and they get that information. They've got more access to your diaries, to your thoughts, to your friends, to your association than any dictator, any government ever had over anybody's home. And that's precisely why the Fourth Amendment has to be expanded in its focus, broadened in its impact to accommodate this modern technological age. Now, the problem with the Roberts Court is that they have not yet applied it to the NSA, and to national security and all that. But if you follow the logic, it's very clear. And it demolishes the anti-privacy argument. And so, finally, just to sort of summarize the whole package, why am I optimistic? I'm optimistic because the Snowden leak showing the complicity of the private telecom companies and internet companies with the government destroyed an illusion about their basic product. These companies said, we are multinational corporations. We are not subject to the whim or will or demands of a national government. We may be American-based, but we are out to serve customers, people all over the world. So you can trust us, whether you live in Germany or you're living in China, because we may be American-based, we may speak English a lot, but no, okay. Well, the Snowden leak showing you go after Angela Merkel or something has just showed this is nonsense, and that in fact, and whether now we can have a lively argument about how much did Google know, and how much did Apple, and how much did Facebook, and how much these people know. But the fact of the matter is it's been made very clear that not only did they do it, they assert the right, the government, our government, asserts the right to do it anytime they want. They actually, not only can they cut into the fiber optic cable lines, not only can they come in backdoor into your whole system, they actually now are actively saying, no, Google and Apple can't do encryption to protect the data of their people because that'll make it more difficult for the FBI, CIA to come in. So they're denying these companies' right to serve. They're really not their customers because they're giving free Gmail and free, we all know that, free search and everything. They're marks because people are turning over this information. But still, they're saying you can't even protect the people using your system. And you can't do encryption because it's making our job difficult. And there's one final point, then, this doesn't mean you can't buy the book or read it because the book lays it all out, I think. But the other point that I want to drive home in the book is that this defense of this is that it makes us safer as an absurd defense, because it makes an assumption about our whole experiment in democracy that is, I think, shames the memory of the founders. Because what it basically says is that freedom is a luxury that can be afforded only in the safest of environments, the best of times. So that's the before and after 9/11 argument. But we were attacked. And that mocks the very idea of freedom as seen by the founders, who argued freedom is something that makes you safer. It's not a luxury. It's something you do to make better decisions. Good ideas drive out error. Free people are people who will be less likely to make mistakes. They will hold their government accountable. We won't go invade Iraq where there's no presence of al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein is effective in controlling them on the argument that he's got weapons of mass destruction. No, we will expose the liars in our government when they lead us astray. So the whole argument about freedom was, no, you need it in the most troubled of times. And indeed, the question I put to people is, where do we get this Fourth Amendment that I just read to you before? We got it when we had just come out with a terrible bloody war with the most powerful country in the world, England. We knew they could return at any time. In fact, they did return in 1812, And so what are you saying? They gave us that guarantee of the Fourth Amendment, along with the First Amendment and all the other amendments, when they were going to be the government. They were going to be the government. And they say, you citizens have to be protected in your freedom to challenge us, to feel secure in your freedom to challenge us, because we are going to be bad guys unless we're challenged. That wisdom has somehow got lost in all this. And so my book, you asked me, and I gave you a long explanation. That's why I wrote the book, is because I hold these ideas to be self-evident. I think they are basic to the experiment in human freedom and the experience of human freedom. And I think in this bizarre, cavalier, dumb way where we've elevated the convenience in shopping to the highest level manifestation of human freedom, and we've said anything that enhances my shopping experience is a good thing, and there's no downside, So, yes, here's my location, and we do, as I say, we give a government anytime we want to hear. I'm here, I'm there, and then you correlate it with the other folks. You know exactly how far I read in the book, who I talked to after I read the book, what music I listen to, who I associate with, where I go, when I go to church, what I do, when I demonstrate, anything, and this can all be put together. And for those who say we have a benign government, well, then not only is that a betrayal of our whole tradition of suspicion of power and government, but it gives license to any government in the world. So, like I say, here's a 2-bit dictatorship in North Korea showed that they could hack into one of the most sophisticated electronic corporations in the world, Sony, and get their most intimate little emails and everything, bad-mouthing each other. If North Korea can do it, any government can do it with just off-the-shelf stuff. That's what Eric Schmidt said in his book. Off-the-shelf stuff, any dictator can do it. And our government has now given a moral cloak to people who do that and say, oh, no, this is what governments have to do. They have to invade the privacy of their citizens. So we betrayed the basic idea. No, we have the sovereignty of the individual has been betrayed, that notion, in the eyes of the world.
So if the Roberts ruling in Supreme Court, which happened the middle of last year, is a step forward, at least recognizing the Fourth Amendment with our electronic devices, the phones, then when is the pushback going to come if the clearly the FISA courts have not honored that in the time that has passed since then. And clearly just recently in the last week or so, the CIA announced its expansion into 10 more sections that'll be monitoring, our data even that much more closely. Right. When's that coming? When's the pushback from the people coming?
Well, that's why I'm here talking to you. I'll take any opportunity to talk to, all due respect, just about anybody who's willing to talk about it. I'm not. It's interesting. The book's only been out now for about a week and a half, but I've done a number of panels. I was back at a forum in New York that had some very smart people there. I get around, and at first I thought, well, all these guys are going to dump on me because, there's a lot of people who've been following these issues, and they know a lot more than I do about some of the ins and outs, the software engineering, and all this stuff, And the only criticism I've gotten so far is I'm being too kind to Google and Apple. And, that's the only criticism I heard. No one says I've painted too dark a picture or, that I'm exaggerating the menace to our freedom. And nor did I get that when I was going around doing these interviews. And I think if you even look at the TED conference where Edward Snowden described that all in the book, where he appears on the head of a robot, and he's in, Moscow and they're interviewing him. Well, that's the elite of the technology. Sergey Brin and all these people were there. These people paid $7,500 for a seat there at this TED conference. And at the end, they gave him a standing ovation because they know he spoke the truth and they knew the business was it. So now in terms of the pushback, let me give you a couple examples. When people run excerpts from my book, like we do on TruthDig or they did on Salon and some other people, you'll notice that at the bottom, because of the algorithms in which Google puts stuff out there, there's I don't know if you'll find it right now, but there's a little ad runs on the bottom. Whether you go to truthdig.com or truthdig.org or whatever, we have all of them. But on the bottom, and it's from Google, and it's a take action alert. It's not coming from somebody else. It's coming from Google. Take action. And it takes you to a site where they say join 3 million people who've already signed up to complain about the surveillance state around the world and are pushing back to save the net. Well, you're getting that message from Wikipedia now. You're getting it from a lot of people. And I'm not saying Wikipedia is the same as Google. Wikipedia is a wonderful institution that's nonprofit, and Google is out for money. But we are getting pushback. And one of the disappointing things is that particularly younger people don't seem to have this fear. I notice in my own teaching, if they've come from another country where freedom is in question, or if their parents have recent memories of freedom being challenged, then they get it right away. But we have been deluded in this country into the idea, even though our government has systematically lied to us, and led us astray. And we can watch a movie like Selma and see, the FBI try to destroy Martin Luther King using what was, by today's standards, very primitive means of surveillance. You had to actually tap into his phone line or have the hotel room next to him and, listen in, follow him, physically. Well, if they had today's means for Martin Luther King, they would destroy him and he wouldn't even know what hit him. They would have so much stuff. They'd make up stuff, plant stuff, drive him crazy. They were trying to drive him to commit suicide. Well, probably would have succeeded with today's means and convince his wife he was doing every nefarious thing in the world, And so we've had people, run into trouble. I don't know, Eliot Spitzer, who I thought was one of the most promising politicians, former governor of New York, who was the attorney general and went after the banks, and suddenly what he does with some prostitutes becomes big public knowledge. Scott Ritter, who was a former Marine who was involved in pointing out there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and played a truly heroic leading role. Next thing you know, he's accused of doing some stuff on the internet with some cop who's pretending to be a young woman, underage, and then boom, he's in a jail for years, So, and we have famous cases, reporters and others being harassed. We know that they go after whistleblowers with a particular vengeance. And, there's one question I raise all the time, who are the good guys in this thing? We always like to think, we know But no, we don't know. I mean, I ask people, I say, well, what about the Obama administration? Was it really just George Bush, who did it? Well, then how come Obama comes in and he's gone after whistleblowers and truth tellers in government and prosecuted more of them than all previous presidents combined? That is a horrible fact. Here's a constitutional law professor who knows everything I've said so far in this interview accords with our sense of American history. Why hasn't he told us? He has the bully pulpit. Why doesn't he get up there and tell people why he's got to cut off the NSA and why he can't let the FBI run amok and so forth? He says he wouldn't be president if not for Martin Luther King. Well, one of the criticisms about Selma was it was too harsh about Lyndon Johnson. Well, but my view of Lyndon Johnson is, why didn't you stop J. Edgar Hoover from trying to destroy King and everybody else? Where were you, Lyndon Johnson? So where is Barack Obama? What is he doing to rein in, the surveillance society? No, he's unleashed it. And then you got Hillary Clinton, who condemns Edward Snowden, like Dianne Feinstein condemns Edward Snowden for being a traitor. Well, those people had high degree of access to everything that Snowden has told us. They knew what was going on. Dianne Feinstein was head of the Intelligence Committee. Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. They knew what was going on. Why didn't they tell us? If all the stuff they were doing, was valid, needed, they say, well, we couldn't tell you because the bad guys would find out. Well, the bad guys assumed the worst about you anyway. Wait, really? I mean, what you bad guy would have to be, mentally, defective to think his cell phone is not tapped, or that you can't read his emails or something. They know that, the people you didn't want to tell was us, because we might object. We might say, no, your claimed ends don't justify those means, and you're not doing the right thing. So they didn't level with us. And then so what is representative government about? It's not about voting. That's what those women did in Iraq, sticking their purple-stained fingers up in the air. No, it's supposed to be about an informed public making decisions about what their interests are.
Speaking of recent developments, another recent development was the fine discovery by, I believe it was Kaspersky, who does internet security-related software, finding out that the NSA has installed on the firmware of most hard drives software that they can monitor what's going on with the hard drive, and that the program goes back 14 years. So basically back to, 9/11. I mean, that seems like to me, that was a pretty scary development, even with all the Snowden revelations, that this program goes that far back and that they have kept it secret for that long. I mean, the hard drives are like on everything now. Obviously, we've got the computers, any of the home, TiVo units use hard drives. It just seems like they've really been working this situation for a long time.
Yeah, you have to ask, what were they thinking? Because maybe they had this idea we'd never learn this, but stuff comes out. It might take longer than you want. But if you really wanted to destroy the internet, the use of computers of any kind, the vitality of any American company being involved, the business model, I mean, what is the message you're sending to the world? You're saying, instead of embracing this World Wide Web, instead of embracing this new technology, instead of seeing it liberating. I remember I was in the old Soviet Union, and I was, covering it for the Los Angeles Times. I was there as a fellow at one point. People had a hard time getting their hands on computers unless they were part of the military establishment. They certainly had a hard time signing on to the internet. They certainly had a hard time exchanging information. And everybody they'd run into at conferences or when you went there, you would know, God, the first step to freedom is to be able to communicate, be able to use this devices. I remember going over my what was it, that Trash 80 or whatever the stuff you got at Radio Shack, and I had a compact was like a sewing machine. I went over one of those. People were marvel what you have. And remember, the first machines that come there, and everybody said, this is going to be the end of totalitarianism. This is going to be the end of the Soviet system. And it was. It was an unraveling or change, profound change. And so we have all along said, most of the people in the United States who know about this, and certainly the companies that sell this stuff, have said, no, this stuff is like the air you breathe. This stuff is conducive to human development. Well, you start mucking about with the hard drives, and you plant your spy stuff there, and you distort it, and you listen to everything, and now there's the fear, like with the 60 Minutes show, where hey, they can use your car and turn it against you, and your car is going to crash, and all the things that can happen, and your heating, thermostat in your house is spying on you, and your television is spying on you, and your desktop is spying on you, even when it's turned off, and so almost any story you can make up about how U.S. imperial government is using the technology of U.S. companies, or even when that technology is assembled abroad, but they can get into it and distort it and turn it into a weapon of coercion and surveillance and so on. Anything you make up, it will probably be proved true, a few months later, weeks later. It's just unbelievable. So if you wanted to disparage an American company that's selling products all over the world, and you just say, well, the NSA just goes in there and hardwires their stuff to make it a spy tool, right? Then you sort of get this whole feeling, well, I don't want to buy anything that any American company has anything to do with, even if it's assembled in China, and then you get balkanization. The people who love the internet, the people who invented it, and when they speak up, and they do increasingly, they say they're ruining the main thing of this. And the main thing of this, that goes to the whole argument about net neutrality. The main vitality of the internet, it should be like unpolluted air. And the only role of governments and regulatory agencies should be to prevent static. We don't all, it's like spectrum space and radio and television, that we don't all talk at the same time, and that the thing can work. That's the whole idea of net neutrality, and then we can all design our own vehicles and everything to get on it. But the main thing is it should not be polluted so that messages can get through. It's not censored, it's not checked, it's not surveilled. And then they use this 9/11 thing as a cop-out and say, no, in order to make ourselves safe, we have to destroy this mechanism, this science, this technology that is really quite liberating until you go mucking about with it. And then, the argument which really requires exploring is the efficiency of what they claim. That's the part that gets me. Because I would make the argument, even if you can show me that you are more efficient by 10, 15, but we still have to argue whether the end justifies the means, because, we believe in freedom, and we believe in freedom even if it's not as efficient as a totalitarian government. But what we've learned down through human history, totalitarian governments are not efficient. They make big errors. They go off the cliff. Hitler didn't do the Germans any great favor. He destroyed what was the most modern, effective, technologically advanced scientific society in the world in a couple of years. So that didn't do anybody any favor. And Stalin and the Soviet model didn't do the Russian people any favor. So terrorizing people and interfering with their freedom doesn't make them happier in any respect. But somehow, again, after 9/11, we had this idea that, the best thing we do to make ourselves secure is frighten the heck out of all of our people. And that is the most appalling part of this whole thing. Because, in fact, when you look at the so-called terrorist danger, and I say so-called because it's not some undifferentiated menace, and it didn't just spring upon us. There's been, if by terrorism we mean attacking ordinary civilians and disrupting civilian life and, bringing war to what should be the ordinary existence of people going to work at the World Trade Center or anywhere else. Well, we've had that since cave dwellers. So there was always some nutcase going to pick up a rock and smash you in the head or something to make some point. And then you had to figure out, can we get together and control that person, or maybe have a village council or and talk and make decisions another way. So that's always been an issue, and terrorism comes from lots of different sources. You had a Jewish terrorist killed Yitzhak Rabin in Israel because he didn't think he was on the right side of the Old Testament, and yet Protestants and Catholics killing each other in Ireland, claiming to be operating out of the same book of revealed truths. I mean, so you got, Chechens taking on Putin, and you got Putin taking on Chechens, and everybody making claim, well, you're using terrorist means. We use what really is the ultimate, so far in human experience, the ultimate terrorist weapon, if by you mean bringing havoc and destruction to people who are just trying to lead a normal life and, intimidate them. That was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For God's sake, I mean, what was that? These are fishermen, kids going to school. The bomb was dropped in the daytime to maximize civilian damage and, fry people. So, terrorism, it cannot be attributed to one religion. The biggest population that's Muslim in this world are in Indonesia, and in that much terrorism. A lot of the terrorism that's connected with the Muslim religion, we deliberately stoke. These are monsters of our creation going to Afghanistan, where under Jimmy Carter and then very much under Ronald Reagan, we're going to, in the words of Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, we're going to give the Soviets their Vietnam, and we're going to overthrow a secular government in Kabul that happens to be close to the Soviets, who are, after all, right on the share border. No, we're going to bring freedom fighters and Muslim nutcases from all over the world to go fight there. And then we get Al-Qaeda, we get the Taliban, and, a lot of these are monsters. Look at what's happened with ISIS. Where did this come from? You had a guy, Assad in Syria, you don't like him, you decide, well, he's not a religious fanatic, and, and somehow you unleash these freedom fighters, and ISIS comes out of that, and then they move into the instability of Iraq. And then, irony of ironies, you turn to another group of Muslims who actually ISIS hates and wants to destroy, called Shiites, and but they happen to be backed by Iran. So now you have this crazy situation where these folks from Iran, who we have said are the biggest menace, and they're going to develop nuclear weapons. No, they're also our allies now in defeating ISIS, because in this situation, they're the right kind of Muslims. And there's stupidity that underwrites this. And it's like, if you take the case of Vietnam, which was always based on idiocy, that, it behooved intelligent people who actually read a book, I mean, this is something I know a lot about because I'm an old guy, not older, I'm an old guy. And so I was in Vietnam in 64, 65, reporting on it. And, looked at this whole situation, wrote about it, and everything. And I remember the question I always had for everybody said, how did you ever believe this made sense? It was a question I put to McNamara at one point. I put to, Bobby Kennedy. I interviewed a lot of people, in my life, Jimmy Carter, go right down the line, the first President Bush and so forth. I even wrote a book called Playing President. All the guys I interviewed, Ronald Reagan very early, before he was governor, before he was president. So I had a lot of experience with these people and doing interviews. And when Vietnam was going on, I was always saying, how did this ever happen? You have a theory that somehow, remember the argument was the domino theory, because this was first time I went there, Cambodia, Vietnam, I thought, well, wait a minute, these people, they're digging in the mud, planting rice. What the hell is going on here? How are they going to cause any trouble for you? Oh, no, there's something called the International Communist Conspiracy and its timetable for the takeover of the world. Boom, that was the theory. And they're all unified. It's, they're international. And if we don't defeat them in Vietnam, we have to defeat them in San Diego. And you say, well, wait a minute. This international communist movement, there aren't two communist governments that can even get along. I mean, Yugoslavia, Tito was a communist country. He rebelled right away, fight. The Sino-Soviet dispute started before there was even Mao got power in China. They were fighting back in the 1920s, the Chinese communists and Russian communists. Then when, Mao takes power, the Sino-Soviet dispute is a reality while we go into Vietnam. But everybody knew about it, and you can go right down the line. That this was not an undifferentiated movement. This was a highly nationalist movement. So, the Cuban communists didn't like the Chinese and the Russian communists, blah, 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 Nationalism really was what defined it. And so your whole theory is wrong and nuts. Doesn't make any sense. And no, it's not true. If we lose in Vietnam, they won't attack San Diego. That's the argument that was told. Young kids went off to fight. Almost 59,000 of them die in Vietnam. 3.5 million Indo-Chinese people die over a fiction that if we don't defeat them there, they're going to take San Diego. So we suffer the most ignominious defeat in human history, of our history, most American history, in Vietnam. And the most ignominious defeat in human history if you think of the disparity of power. Here was the incredibly powerful military machine of the United States done in by a peasant army, okay? And so we have this ignominious defeat. People are lifted off the roof of the American embassy. Terrible situation, blah, blah, blah. And what happens? I ask people this all the time. What happened to your prediction they would be in San Diego? They're in San Diego, all right. They're fighting for shelf space at Walmart and Costco with the Chinese communists. They're competing. I said, but where are their military? Where are they fighting? Well, what happened after we lose in Vietnam? Communist China and Communist Vietnam go to war. And they're still fighting over these bloody islands and everything else. They're still fighting. So the whole theory was wrong. Same thing happens with this terrorism thing. We don't really want to know where it comes from. We have an undifferentiated, simplistic view of this thing. We will ignore the fact that, for instance, Saudi Arabia has been the main funder of Muslim, Sunni terrorism. We ignore their role in religious fanaticism. We ignore the whole politics of the region. We dropped our concern about the Muslim bomb in Pakistan because we want Pakistan to back us going into Afghanistan and the fighting in Iraq. So stupidity reigns. And yet intelligence is used as an excuse. We're gathering intelligence. Everything has to be secret. And the value of the first, not the first whistleblower, but the one we remember is Daniel Ellsberg. And Daniel Ellsberg, when I've interviewed him, and for my book, he talks about, he waited 40 years for another whistleblower, and that was Edward Snowden. I mean, there was some in between. What was the significance of Daniel Ellsberg? And if you get the back of my book, you'll see I have a blurb from Daniel Ellsberg, who remembers that I was at his trial, but also John Dean, who was in the White House as White House counsel then. They're both blurbing my book, and I know both these guys. So you ask yourself, what was that about? What was the Pentagon Papers about? Well, no one's ever been able to say there was a single secret in the Pentagon Papers that we didn't have a right to have. Because Daniel Ellsberg didn't just turn over the whole thing. He picked what he thought. He was an expert on national security, so he didn't turn over some stuff that he thought maybe could compromise some individuals. He turned it over to senators. Then he turned it over, like Snowden. Snowden turned it over to the Washington Post, the Guardian. You can just throw it out there, and let them make decisions about how to handle this material. So what did we learn from the Pentagon Papers? We learned that the Vietnam War made no sense. And we also learned if you tie this thing up and get out of there, you're going to be a lot better off. But we didn't share that information with the American people. We just let the American people in on something that they had a right to know, but their knowing it proved embarrassing for the administration that gotten everybody killed. See? So that's the whole thing with the Snowden leaks. It's an embarrassment to people who betrayed their corporate entities in cooperating or going along with the CIA when they shouldn't have, and the NSA, and the government that claimed to be making it safer, but wasn't. Okay? So it's to prevent the embarrassment of these politicians. The founders gave us these protections of a free press and everything precisely because we do want to embarrass people of power, say the emperor doesn't have clothes, so we can get rid of guys when they screw up and put in people who don't screw up.
So just about 5 minutes. So do these people in power, so many of them that you have personally interviewed, do they actually believe the lies that they're passing on to us?
Well, the biggest liar, I shouldn't say the biggest liar, but the one who got the most people killed that I interviewed was Robert McNamara. And the interesting thing is, I don't know why I'm laughing because it's tragic, but he went after being, I challenged him. We both happened to be speaking at Harvard at one point when there was a big demonstration and he was still Secretary of Defense and he wouldn't debate the issue. And I was the editor of Ramparts. I wrote that. But when I finally got to interview him, he was head of the World Bank and he put Vietnam off limits. I mean, it was amazing that he was willing to be interviewed. And then we got that movie, the Fog of War, which if people haven't ever seen that documentary, they should go get it somehow. And basically, the story of Robert McNamara. And at the end of his life, he gave this interview, and he wrote a book too, and in which he basically admitted he didn't know which end was up. And he was part of a bureaucratic machinery, and Lyndon Johnson had gone wild, and the thing never made any sense. And he even says in the fog of war, I could have been judged. If we had lost the war, meaning America was not so powerful, because we did lose the war, he said, I would have been judged a war criminal. And not only for Vietnam, for he was involved with the strategic bombing of Japan as a much younger man, and their deliberately destruction of Japanese villages and cities, to make a political point. Well, that's terrorism. That's exactly what has been defined as a war crime. So, I would say McNamara, he went to his grave, very depressed fellow. His son had stopped talking to him, was very critical of what he'd done. He had gone through some self-examination. I would say one of the guys I find really interesting is Ronald Reagan. And I never was one who thought Ronald Reagan was some kind of simpleton. I always thought it was like you shouldn't demean actors. Most of the actors I know are quite intelligent. Reagan had run a union, the Screen Actors Guild. He grew up in the Depression. His father lost his job just like my father did. His father went to work for the New Deal, and his first biography, Where's the Rest of Me, Reagan said, if not for the New Deal, I wouldn't have been able to grow up properly. I wouldn't have gone to school or anything. And so, and then he said, the Democratic Party left me, I didn't leave. But it's not true. He drank the Kool-Aid of GE and everything, and he went another way. And yet, at the end of his life, I think Reagan, first of all, he invaded Grenada. That's not the same as the country's other presidents have invaded. He turned out to be more limited in what he did. But the other interesting thing about Reagan is he's the guy who opened up to Gorbachev at the end. And the two old coots there sitting there saying, why do we need these weapons? You can't use them. They're terrible. They're genocidal. Let's get rid of them. And there was these folks out there, the hardline hawks, that's when they started getting agitated about whether Reagan's got Alzheimer's or senile or something, because it was making sense. So I think Reagan at the end, he had also learned with the savings and loan scandal that happened on his watch that these bankers weren't so wonderful and that business had to be watched. And so, as I pointed out in my last book, The Great American Stick-Up, at the end of Reagan's term, he actually was put through more regulation rather than less. So, I once wrote a thing about how, my whole analysis of Reagan, and then I got a nice little personal letter from Nancy Reagan thanking me for my insights. So maybe she even agreed with me. I don't know. But it was a nice little note. And I got a similar letter from Richard Nixon. I pointed this out about Nixon. It's in my Playing President book. I went and interviewed him, and I developed this idea. After all, Nixon, the end, he wanted to have detente with the Soviets. Now they're beating Obama over the head for trying to have a deal with Iran to try to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, so give diplomacy a chance. Now, so Obama's being attacked mostly by these Republicans, but some Democrats, well, they forget it was Richard Nixon who made the opening to China and made the opening to Russia and realized it was a dead end to keep fighting with these people, So maybe he got some wisdom.
All right. Well, unfortunately, with that, we are out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us today.
Okay, and thanks for giving me the opportunity. And you know what? We can talk 6 months from now. You can tell me whether I got it right or wrong.